I would like to invite Kris again to the stage for the second part of his lecture, Case Studies, Successes and Failures from 4 years of Digital Projects.
This is the second half, and this is going to be hopefully the more fun bit where we stop talking about kind of principles and start talking really about some of the practice. What I hope with the projects I'm going to show you is that some of these become inspiration for some of the things you might do. I feel like I've done an incredible range of things in a very short space of time in the museum sector, and what I'd hope to show you today is just how those projects can come about, what they can be, and the kind of impacts that they can have. You'll see in some ways that there are different threads that bind them all together. Some of these are about social media, some of these are about projects out on the web, some of these are about things that you put inside museums, some of them are about data and business models and the things that you can change. All of them come back to the question I talked about before, which is how is digital and the internet changing the world, and how is that changing the world affecting the things that museums can do? So the things I'm going to talk about now is just some principles of some successful digital projects. To look back now at what becomes a historical period for me of being at the British Museum 2014 to 2017. It already starts to feel like a long time ago that I was there. To talk really about the present. I've been at the National Gallery now for 6 months, and we're already trying to do things that are different from anything I could have done at the British Museum, and which point towards our own future strategy. And then I'm going to look ahead to the future, because ultimately when you do digital, you're always trying to think what the future means, and to talk to you about what I'm actually really going to try and do at the National Gallery in the years ahead. I am, in the course of this presentation, going to show you some videos so you're not just listening to my voice for the equivalent of a soccer match worth of time, and to show you some other things, but we might break everything as we try and do that. So apologies in advance if YouTube fails us in this process. Ways to think about successful projects and some measures to look at with them. I said in the presentation before that there's only really 2 core measures: the size of audience you get to and the money and where it figures out at the end. Those work when you're talking to museums in their governance capacity, but some other things to think about when you do digital projects are some measures that you can take for yourselves that might not boil down to numbers, that might not be things that you can show in graphs or on spreadsheets, but that become things that you can think about from a cultural point of view. And so 4 things I think about when I think about digital projects are whether they exceed a goal that you've set for them. Targets for organizations only matter, actually, I think, if you miss them or if you exceed them. Otherwise, you're just kind of conservatively getting them right. And when you do more than you thought you could do, I think that makes for a successful project. When they change someone's assumption about what they think digital actually means, I think that's another measure of success. If you can talk to someone in an organization and say, does this mean digital means something you didn't think it meant before? Then I think you can take them for themselves that it's done something they didn't think was possible. And I think that's incredibly important, because part of what digital is about cultural change. The third bit is about endurance. I talked just before the break about this thing at the Natural History Museum where you pressed a yellow button, and 30 years later, and in 1984 it was there, and in 2014 it was still there. Endurance in its own way is not a bad thing. While some digital things that we create are incredibly ephemeral, that last only for minutes, possibly hours in their the value of their existence, things that take on a life of their own, that continue to grow over time, are incredibly valuable. And some of the projects I'll talk about here have continued to grow over the space of the last 3 years in ways that I couldn't have predicted when we started to do them. And the fourth is about dying gracefully. Messy deaths are no good for anybody. They require many meetings to discuss. They require budgets that have gone wrong. And all of us will have, in whatever we do in life, projects that don't die well. If projects can come to an end naturally, can conclude and then move on, I think that's something we can really hope for in the projects that we do. The thing is, though, these are guidelines. These are things culturally to think about. No project has to do all of these things. I don't know if there is a dream project out there that beats its goals, that changes assumptions, that lives for a long time and then dies quietly. That's like a dream human being, and most of us don't meet many dream human beings in our lives, and similarly, we may not meet many dream projects in the things that we do. But if we can look at some of these things and think these things have happened, I think it's a meaningful gesture. So, looking back to the past, 2014 already seems a long time ago. This was pre-Donald Trump, pre-fake news. Artificial reality was much less talked about in the world around us than it is now, and the world was significantly a different place. Better place? I'm not sure. Different, definitely. Back in 2014, and I mentioned this previously, Minecraft was a really important thing. Now, Minecraft no one has thought about actually for about the last 2 years. But back in 2014, Minecraft was the thing that was changing the way children behave forever. Whenever you hear the word forever with digital, you know that you're talking about something that's not true. But back in 2014, Minecraft was changing the way children all around the way interact, behave, are educated and learn together. Unfortunately, what happened is that Microsoft bought Minecraft and the whole thing seemed to tumble apart immediately afterwards. But back then it seemed like a way that collaboration between children, between teenagers, creativity, making new things together was going to reshape the world around it. So I thought, as we worked at the British Museum, just at the very beginning of being there, this was August, I think, 2014, so I'd been there 4 months, could we do something about it? And that question was asked to me, actually, by someone who worked for me. I was very lucky to have, at that point, one of those brilliant young guys that everyone says you should get when you run a digital department. 22 years old, straight out of university, played in a punk rock band, wore stupid trousers, had silly coloured hair, and knew by definition of being who he was and being the age he was, or things about the internet that I didn't know. He came to me in my office and said, "Chris, should we put the British Museum in Minecraft?" And I thought about it, not for very long. I probably should have thought about it for long. I said, well, yeah, why not? Let's do it. We had this extraordinary meeting where these two people that we only knew as names on the internet emerged as real human beings into real life. One was a 14-year-old boy, and I'm not sure I think he probably left school to do it. The other guy was a guy in his 50s, and they made this kind of odd pairing together, coming to tell us what this possibility could be. And somewhere in the act of doing this, the world started to take notice about what digital could mean at the British Museum, because that notion of we are creating something new here that we haven't done before went out into the world, and the media listened to it. And we were very, very shocked the next morning when this story ended up on the front of the BBC website. British Museum creates itself in Minecraft. One of those stories that kind of spreads and say, well, they're doing something. And none of us quite knew what it meant. There was no plan, there was no definition of it. But it started to put a kind of dent into the universe that said the British Museum is going to try and do something new that it's not done before, that asks and listens to its audience about the potential of what they could do with it. And for me, in a way, it needs to be no deeper a strategic gesture than that. The British Museum actually never was fully made in Minecraft because we never could quite work out what we were going to do once we'd done it. But that sense of trying to do something was very meaningful. And for me, it started as I was really at the beginning of doing a digital strategy at the British Museum. It started a process that everyone in the museum could say, well, look, something is happening here. And whilst we don't know what it means, we can start to see the signs of it, like a flower starting to bloom, and wait to see what happens next. The second then becomes a story about how things endure over time. One of the next things we started to think about as we started digital at the British Museum was about how storytelling was going to work in the 21st century. The British Museum was very lucky with its director, Neil McGregor, who was a phenomenal public communicator. And his communication lived in lectures, things that people would hear from him directly that they'd remember forever, and increasingly through radio series. Back in 2009, one of the most famous radio series ever created in the UK, History of the World in 100 Objects, took the story of the history of the world and retold it through 100 objects from the British Museum's collection every day for 15 minutes on Radio 4. It's a phenomenal project which actually marked in some ways the transition from traditional media to digital media, because those stories started to live not only as radio shows broadcast live and reheard later, but as podcasts. And those podcasts have now been downloaded over 60 million times. That's astonishing, but it wasn't planned, because it marked a point in time when that became possible, but no one thought about that at the time. But we wanted to try and think ahead to what the next generation of storytelling on behalf of museums would mean. And we looked and saw that this could really come from video-based storytelling. Now, this was happening at a moment where the world was starting to see video differently. Back in 2014 to 2015, again, it was a transitional point in the development of a media. Suddenly, not only had YouTube grown to astonishing scale, but Facebook was starting to put video available. It seems remarkable now, video actually only launched on Facebook 2 years ago. Twitter was starting to feature video. There was a thing called Vine, which no longer exists, which were these little 6-second videos that people could watch of someone doing magic tricks or falling over or whatever it was. And suddenly something was starting to move out in digital culture that was becoming a new way of telling stories. And what we wanted to do was capture that into the world of what museums did as storytellers. And so we took the notion that there is no one more in museums that can tell stories better than curators. I say that because I've had the pleasure of working with people like Irving Finkel, who some of you I know here will know personally. Irving is one of those remarkable human beings who could probably only be a museum curator. You can't have beards like that in many professions, for a start. But also the depth of passion and knowledge that he has about Mesopotamian archaeology is so incredibly rich, so grounded in the core of who he is as a human being, that I felt we could take the stories that he can tell and bring them to a public in ways that they would really care about. Irving's a very particular case of that because his is a personal story as much as it is a professional one. He tells himself many times the story of being an 8-year-old, coming to the British Museum for the first time, seeing the Mesopotamian collection and seeing the board game of Ur and thinking, this is it. This is what I want to do with my life. And he became that child who looked at something in a museum, went to university to study the discipline that came from that early passion, and then took it through his professional life. And we'll see him all through his career. He has never been anything but a British Museum curator, and in some ways he probably never could have been anything but a British Museum curator. And we wanted to distill that passion into a context that the world could share. So we looked at YouTube and say, well, look, what do people do on YouTube? And actually what people do on YouTube is they tell stories from their bedrooms. Kids sit in their rooms and tell the story of how they play Minecraft, how to do the latest makeup techniques. They share this kind of personal expertise that the world can now share amongst itself and tell their stories to the world. That's created an entirely new generation of social media stars who become famous for no more than pointing a phone at themselves and talking. And we thought, well, let's point a phone at these people and let them talk. And so we created a video program, Curator's Corner, that took that notion of the person talking in their bedroom and took it to where curators talk from. They're very weird and wonderful places, full of weird and wonderful things. Cupboards full of objects from the 13th century, fragments of pottery from the 4th century BC, endless amazing things that they understand and represent and study. And we wanted to bring that storytelling to them there. And so we began this storytelling process of curators talking from their corner. And it's one of those things that's flourished and grown. And one of the things that's been amazing about it is seeing the way it's changed those metrics about reach that I talked about before. Because when we've done that, we started with a YouTube channel that over 5 years, basically no one had watched. 1 million people in 5 years had watched 100 videos that the British Museum had made. By starting this process of storytelling, starting it with the people in the museum and the stories that they could tell in very simple ways, we started to transform the reach of the organisation to a digital universe. And that 1 million people in 5 years very quickly became 1 million people a month, watching the things that we put onto YouTube, watching the Facebook Live broadcast that we did. But we never would have done that unless the curators could, and the people who know the objects and the collections best could be the storytellers on its behalf. Because what you need is that community of experts to come with you on the journey into that type of storytelling. In many ways, the thing I was most proud of when we did that was that a year later, we could actually take that into the conservators, to the scientists, people who aren't public storytellers in the nature of their actual professional careers. But they would let us, they trusted us enough to bring the phone and bring the camera and therefore bring the world into their world and start telling stories about it. We did a 10-part series about the preservation of a Roman urn on YouTube and Facebook. It doesn't sound intuitively like the next Game of Thrones. But actually 600,000 people watched those videos in the course of 3.5 months. We took an audience on a journey about the very, very specialist things museums do and brought it to them in ways that they found meaningful, because we collapsed the boundary between the audience and the museum. And it was an incredibly important gesture, starting to think about museums' role in the world ahead. Another example from a different context was the work that we did with Google. I think Google are one of those institutions that tests the trust that museums have in the digital space. Google Arts and Culture, for those of you who know, is an idea that was started back in about 2010 by a guy called Amit Sood, who wanted to ask a question about what Google should do about art on the internet. That's grown into a program that works all across the world now. They've worked with 1,800 museums now around the world. And they try and bring, in the way that Google thinks about the world, which is different from the way that we think about the world, they try and bring the power of Google and combine it with the power of museums. The British Museum was one of those museums that felt reticent about the things that Google were doing with the internet. We couldn't understand, quite figure out from a rights point of view, from a relationship point of view, what was going to be the benefit for us. My way of thinking is actually to strip some of that question away and say, well, look, let's not ask in advance what the benefit might be. Let's do something and find out what the benefit is from doing it. And that's a question of trust that you have to build in an organization to get to that point of experiment. But I asked it a different way around and said, okay, what if we try and do the biggest thing that you could do with Google? We're the British Museum. We see ourselves as one of the great big institutions of the world. Somewhere in this process, we need to think about what's the biggest thing we can do with an institution like Google that really, again, tries to throw a rock into the water and do something different. It was hard to find that angle, but in the course of the project we did with them, we found two ways of expressing that potential of scale that the British Museum and Google had together. The first was in the slightly lunatic idea of trying to put the whole of the British Museum into Street View. Street View, as many will know, is a way of navigating through maps in a semi-3D virtual space. For any of you who go through the process of doing it in your own museums, it's a fairly tedious process. Day after day, night after night, a man and a Google camera will turn up and take photos inside your institution. They'll have to do it when no one's cleaning the floors, no one's opening the cupboards, when there's nothing in the way and everything is empty. And for those of you, again, who know museums, know that that actually doesn't happen very often. So across the 300,000 square foot of the British Museum, all 85 public galleries, the libraries and some of the main behind-the-scenes rooms, we wanted to do this. It took a year of them coming and taking photos, coming back to redo it, to do the ones again that were broken. And eventually at the end of that year, we had enough material to do it. And we plotted objects on so you could find out where they were. And the kind of insane labor of doing it became, in a way, part of the journey itself. And this is one of those projects I was proud that when Neil McGregor could look at it, he could say, this is what the British Museum was there to do. It's the principle that this is a place everyone in the world should have access to, and that this was the first time in its 250-year history that existed entirely in a digital space that the whole world could get access to. We will never get 7 billion people into the British Museum in Bloomsbury, but we could get them into this digital space. And it mattered to us greatly in the act of doing that. Next is taking the role of mobile seriously and trying to do something that makes use of the devices you all have in your pockets now in the way people experience the museum. My way of starting that process off was to think about audio guides. Audio guides are, again, one of these old things that museums have been doing that they don't really think about the history of very much or think how they can evolve. For those of you who know, audio guides began back in the 1960s. You used to strap an 8-track recorder around your neck and walk around the museum and stop and try and make sense of the technology as you did it. Tape players, CDs. Eventually, these funny devices that we now have, and I see that they're just outside the door here, where you press numbers on keypads and look for stickers on the side of cases. It's not a very nice experience, and not many people, and too few people use them as a result. I wanted to start asking the question around what mobile could do in museums by trying to rebuild that process. Make a good mobile app. Give it to people in the way they want it, which is they still at this point largely want to hire devices. Chinese tourists, and clearly Israeli museums are being transformed by Chinese tourism, want that act of being able to take a device where they know the technology works, but make it a mobile experience that they can recognise and one that they can work with. And we did that, and it started to change the way that mobile worked in the museum. We went from a history of 2.5% of people using that, which still in a museum in our terms is 200,000 people a year, and we doubled it to 400,000 people a year. We rebuilt it as a commercial business, and it created a profit of over an extra £1 million a year to the museum by hiring these devices out. And again, it starts to change the fabric of the museum, running a really vital business that then becomes a core part of the museum experience. Possibly the crucial one, and one of the ones that was difficult, really difficult to do at the British Museum, was starting to think about the role of data. So when I walked into the British Museum, I was leaving a mobile apps company. I made dozens of mobile apps for people like Disney, people like the BBC over the space of a few years. One of the things I found remarkable from the act of making mobile apps, having come from digital worlds where you didn't know everything about your audience, was that I came from a world where I suddenly knew everything everyone in my audience was doing. I could open the analytics program about the apps I made and look in the back end of them and see every gesture being made live, every button being pressed, every swipe of the screen. Everything was recorded and known. And in that small closed universe of a mobile app, I think in some ways I knew more about my audience than many museums have known in the hundreds of years that they've existed. And I walked into the British Museum and looked around and said, there must be so much information here. The conservation systems on the wall recording temperature, the CRM systems sending emails, ticketing systems, membership systems, lighting systems, everything now generates data. But then I started to ask the question, well, what do we know about what that means? And everyone knew a bit about the system that they managed. The ticketing guy knew how many people bought tickets. The conservation guy knew what the temperature was. The Wi-Fi guy knew how many people were going into each gallery each day. But across all of those things, could anyone look at multiple pieces of data together and say, what difference does it make about the weather outside for the number of people that come to the museum to the number of people that then buy tickets to the exhibition? And so we started going on a journey, and it was a very, very painful one to try and bring those sources of data together. We started by counting how much data there was, and we stopped counting when we got to 250 different data sources because it was just too much. We were never going to be able to do anything with that many disparate sources of data. And we narrowed it down and felt, well, there are 10 or 15 things here that if we can look at them together, we can start to learn things we never did before. And so we tried to build a program around data in the museum that would try and start a process of learning and then of changing about things that museum could do. I will say this is one of those projects that remained unfinished because it's a journey that's not easy to do in days or weeks or months or even years. It's a long-term institutional change that actually may take generations to do. At least that's what I thought, and I'll show you some of the things we're now learning at the National Gallery, where I've had the chance to begin that process again. One of the things, and these are one of those projects that no one again will ever thank me for in public, one of the things I'm most proud that I did at the British Museum was to create a new kind of customer service discipline. Customer service and visitor service is one of those things in museums I find strange and odd. There has been a great history, particularly in British museums, I think also in American museums and certainly in French museums, of letting the person who comes come in anonymously, stay anonymous, have very little interaction with human beings whilst they're in the museum, and leave in that anonymous state that they joined. As someone who's new to museums, I find that strange, because when I walk into shops, people say hello to me. It's a legacy of 1980s customer service in American stores like Gap and Abercrombie and Fitch. When I walk into theatres, the person at the box office says hello to me. But when I walk into the museum, people ignore me. I don't think that's a good thing. What I found equally strange was when I looked at the internet, where the whole world could be talking about what happened in their experience of the museum. Every museum ignored me. I read reviews on TripAdvisor that said I had an amazing time at the British Museum, the Guggenheim, the Israel Museum, or anywhere else around the world. And they said that comment, and no one said anything in response to them. There is a museum in New York that I won't mention that has terrible, terrible reviews on TripAdvisor. It considers itself one of the great museums of the world, and yet virtually every comment said, the staff are incredibly rude when I come here, and I never want to go there, and I feel like you ripped me off for the ticket fee as a result. And I don't find that acceptable in a world where the customer now gets the chance to talk in so many different channels online. So one of the things that we created was a digital customer services function at the British Museum. A function where some people were given the task to respond to everything that everybody said online about us. And the process had to start with everything and filter down as we tried to work out what was meaningful, because you live in a world of noise out there. But we wanted to understand the noise. Tens of thousands of reviews on Google. And somehow we had to engage with this. And if it meant no more than liking every positive review and making sure every negative review was responded to, I think that was enough. And you could start to see the process of change that it made, because suddenly we were winning TripAdvisor Destination of the Year in London every year for 3 years. Suddenly we could see the quality of reviews going up. And it meant that we could start to understand ourselves better and show that we were caring about our audience more. Next one, creating a new collection. So I'll talk about this very quickly because I know we're going to start running out of time, is that one of the things that's happening in the academic space is a change in what digitization means. Now, for many institutions, the notions of still getting pictures and metadata on the internet is still a new thing. But as we look outside, we can see that out there in the outside world, new types of collection digitization are taking place. What seemed an opportunity to me was saying, we're a museum full of three-dimensional stuff. Well, let's start creating a 3D digitized collection. And so we started a process that now runs to about 250 objects of people making scans of objects with their mobile phones largely, or with simple digital cameras, and publishing them onto an amazing platform called Sketchfab. That's led to us into a new space where we can start to interrogate the meaning of things like 3D printing, again by working with the audiences that understand them best, and starting to create types of digitization that just aren't possible in normal museum contexts. These types of brilliant digitizations of the Lewis Chessman now feature audio commentaries. You can go from stop to stop on objects, being given little bits of extra narrative as you go along. And that takes us into realms of hundreds of thousands of new people connecting with us in new ways that they couldn't before. So that's the past. Some of that past is still living now. Those video programs, that 3D digitization, those things are still taking place. But in the present for me has been the last 6 months at the National Gallery and the things that we've started to do there. The first of those projects that I'll talk about is about, again, how do you start to make something real? And I was lucky to walk into the beginnings of a project that's been a very, very large demonstration of the things the National Gallery can do as it embraces digital strongly in the months and years ahead. This program that we created called Sunflowers Live was about asking what probably the most famous painting in the world, possible exception of the Mona Lisa, what it could mean to an audience in a new digital space. We started from the insight that when we bring any of the different Van Gogh sunflowers together, they create an incredible public reaction. Back in 2014, we brought 2 of the 6 sunflower paintings together in one room. And the volume of audience reaction, the queues down the road was an incredible thing. But what happens if we could bring all of them into a virtual space together? We did that working with 4 other museums across 3 continents. And in one day in August, we told the story of these phenomenal paintings through Facebook and through virtual reality. Each curator who knows those paintings best stood in front of the painting with someone pointing either a camera or a mobile phone at them and told its story. Very, very simple, the purest of museum experiences in many ways. But across those 5, they built momentum. We got to share our audiences together. We got to talk at a global level about something that otherwise might remain local. And that took us to 6 million people watching those videos in the course of a day. Facebook became interested in the things that they do. And about a month before we put this project live, they said, let's do a thing in virtual reality together. And working with them, particularly with the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, and brilliantly with Theo van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh's great-grandnephew, we created this virtual reality exhibition. Virtual reality is one of those things that people find hard to make sense of as a technology, so you have to humanize that technology in the way you tell stories about that. Theo van Gogh's role in that did that humanizing process, because he's the only human being alive that can talk about those paintings really from real personal experience. When he was a child, he sat in his grandparents' dining room in Amsterdam, and above the dining table hung one of those great paintings. And that personal experience of the work, combined with the kind of funkiness of the new technology, again impacted very deeply on the world and took that story in 3 days to 6.9 million people viewing it. 6.9 million. Good numbers. More people than come to the National Gallery every year. And it took it through the world's media. Articles in the New York Times, feature articles in the Sunday Times that my mum finally understands a little bit of what I do. A little bit, not very much. Sheryl Sandberg, Facebook's COO, one of the great women of our era, with her brilliantly insightful comment, "This is so cool." And it's good to do cool things occasionally. But this showed to the National Gallery, to ourselves, to our public, to all our stakeholders that we could do things in this space and that we could make real significant impact for ourselves and our publics with the things that we do. Data, for me, has to be, and this is the next few projects talk about this, the opportunity for change in the way that museums operate. We can learn things about our audience and with our audience that help us change the things we do. For those of you who know British museums, we are all free. It's very close to the spirit of why we think museums exist, is to be public institutes of education, and institutes of education shouldn't have a cost of entry. That means that in a changing economic world, we have hard times that we have to deal with from a financial point of view. Our public funding has gone down by 30% in the last decade, and it's not going to get better. It will probably get worse. So we have to think about the ways that we actually generate revenue from our audience if we want to prosper in the future. One of the bits I think we can do that with is the lonely, unloved donation box. Sits in the corner of the room. People ignore it because they can ignore it. Our deeply insightful strategy was to take this notion that everyone ignores you in museums and reverse it. So what we did was we employed, and are employing, a bunch of actors to smile, say hello to you, and ask help you have a great visit to the museum, but also ask you for a donation as you come through the door. Well, that's not a digital gesture, that's just a human gesture. But the other thing they're doing when they ask you for that donation is they're recording data. Which of our 4 audience segments does this person sit in? How much money did they give? When did they give it? Where did they give it? And by knowing those things, we can understand things about our audience that we didn't know before. Asian visitors give at twice the rate of any other audience that comes to the museum, but they only give half as much money. American tourists give twice as much money as anybody else. But we didn't know that before. All we saw were £5 notes sitting in a box. And as you start to create data sets, you can start to think about how you can change that value that you can bring back from that. And that's about going out and taking control through the power that the internet brings and doing things that you wouldn't have done before. Again, not a digital initiative in itself, but using data and the power of digital to do things that you wouldn't have been able to do so far. And it has increased our level of donations by 4 times in the space of a month. That's real money. That pays for people's jobs, pays for things that we wouldn't have been able to do before, and makes us more resilient in a difficult financial context. Next are those ideas around data, and I mentioned it before. Think about the pricing model for tickets. If you buy something from Amazon, if you buy an airline ticket, there is no such thing as a fixed price anymore out in the digital universe. So why do our museum prices always the same? For ourselves, for our audiences, we've got to change the model of how we ask for price things commercially and understand that it can fluctuate by time of day, by who's coming, and by where you buy it from. And so we've begun a process of moving to a dynamic priced model at the BM. Again, recognizing that we can learn things quickly through the data that's generated that allow us to make decisions where we can change the price every day, every week if we need to, respond to what happens in the real world, rather than making an educated guess 6 months before an exhibition opens and then crossing our fingers and hoping it works. We are in a privileged position through the data that we generate to be able to change things, and we have to be able to do that in a changing economic circumstance and environment. I said at the British Museum doing big data would prove difficult. As markets evolve, suddenly things become easier. I'm very delighted to work with a startup in New Zealand. Who'd have thought you could work up with a startup in New Zealand around museum analytics? This is the changing world we live in. There is now a brilliant company called Dexhibit, which is a specialist big data platform for museums. That's a very particular niche that they're operating in. But they're doing it because they think the sector needs it and because the sector increasingly believes that it does. What we've done with Dexhibit in 3 months is basically what it took me 3 years to do at the British Museum, to work out the data sources we have, to bring them into one place, and to start to ask questions about what that data means. We're working with them on programs like forecasting exhibition attendance algorithmically, For those of you who know who work in exhibitions, it's very difficult to figure out how many people are going to come because you just don't have enough information from which to do it. But if we look at 20 or 30 data sources together around it, we think that we can get to an answer. It also tells us things we just didn't know before. Everyone thinks of Britain and they think it's going to rain. If you think of Britain in your head now, you're thinking of rain. People in museums think that the amount of people coming to museums is massively influenced by the rain. The thing is, it actually doesn't rain very much in London. And so the biggest thing that influences museum attendance is not rain in Britain, which is actually only on about 20 days a year. It's actually on temperature. Museum attendance goes up significantly when goes down significantly when it gets hot outside. And so we can start to think about market. Yeah. Well, that's test the assumption. Your sun might be our rain. But you can start to think about marketing that you do differently. Use Twitter to say, it's cold outside, come to the museum. Respond to the live environment that you live in and live in a more fluid world through the things that you can do with data. Quick one then, talking about mobile. Again, at the British Museum, we had to rebuild our mobile app ourselves, go through a big, long, complicated process to take the opportunity to use mobile phones for our visitors better. The world is speeding up around us, and suddenly there is a rich ecosystem of startups out there offering brilliant mobile products for the museum environment. We've launched already with what I think is the best of these, which is a company called Smartify. Smartify does that thing everyone thinks mobile phones should be able to do in museums, which is simply that I hold my phone up in front of them, it works out what the picture I'm looking at is and serves me interesting content around it. That process starts to do the things that starts to solve the problems that we worry about with phones. Are they getting in the way of the experience? Are they making it difficult for people to interpret? Are they merely a distraction? They make the phone a powerful tool in our hands to take back some measure of control over that process of interpretation. And again, this is signs of a speeding up universe in terms of what museums and technology are doing. That this isn't the only startup doing this kind of brilliant technology. There's 5 or 6 great companies across the world now starting to do this. And I say simply to museums, it's really hard building your own applications. It takes money and time. Find these companies and work with them because they're spending other people's money to do it so that you don't have to spend your own. The last one, and this is something we're doing now, is about trying to make new friends. One of the things that always worried me at the BM was that if I wanted to talk to technology companies, who could I talk to? There was only Google, really. They were the only big player out there who were interested. I talked to all the rest of them, talked to Amazon, talked to Apple. There was nowhere to talk to that was really going to make a difference. So I have focused my energy entirely on Facebook because they are the biggest beast in the wilderness doing this. And just keep talking, what can we do together? And we're now at a point where we're starting to find ways to partner together. The angle in with Facebook has been around Oculus Rift, their virtual reality proposition, and we started to create virtual reality tours of the gallery through the things that they offer. Again, this is partnerships where they create the content, we provide the material that goes inside it, but we're starting to then create the opportunity for a technology ecosystem around us that's richer. And that for me is really where I then bridge into the question of the future. Because ultimately, what do I really want to do at the National Gallery is beyond the things I have to do. I have to build a new website, I have to get more social media audiences. Beyond those practical things, what I really want to do is get an ecosystem for digital in Britain that works. We're at a changing time in museums where it's not just about us as individual institutions anymore. It's about us as a network of institutions and then the network of organisations that we sit amongst, all caring about what digital means in those institutions. And the job I see really in the years ahead is about how we bind the different parts of that ecosystem together and make sense of it collaboratively. So on one side, I care about government. Government give us 50% of our money. And for the government to understand digital, we have to work more collaboratively with them. Government funds many innovation institutions in the UK like Nesta and Digital Catapult, who all need to understand that museums can do interesting and innovative things and have a role to play in a digitised society. There are institutions like the Collections Trust, which I'm a trustee of, which provide data standards and methods for how the the sector should work, and those have to come closer to museums in the way that they create things. Funders, Bloomberg on one side, phenomenal funder of digital projects all around the world. Institutions like our lottery fund that provides inward funding into institutions. All of these have to understand that digital really means something for museums and have ways to work collaboratively with them that bring change together. As I said, at the other side of that, Google, Facebook, Snapchat. Everyone talks about Snapchat in museums. I have absolutely no idea what Snapchat means for museums, but I know it means something, and we'll figure it out. The BBC, the great arts broadcaster of the UK, again, we have to find ways of working closer together. And then we also have to create space for the unknowns to happen, where the audience generates something, where new technologies come through that we can react to in ways that have some structure around them and allow new things to happen. Because it comes back in a way to that, all comes back to me to that first project I did with Minecraft 3 years ago, which was how you create surprise, respond to new things, and how you create a structure and infrastructure that allows those things to happen. 3 years ago, I had to do it by not telling anyone about it at the British Museum. It's not really the way things should work in the future. So now I have to create a rich ecosystem of partners, of institutions and organisations that can help not just the National Gallery, but all museums in Britain to grow together. Because if we're really going to get to a point where we can say, well, look, digital transformation has happened to this sector, it's not just big museums sitting in very famous public spaces in London. It's about every small museum. The Barnet Museum at the end of my road, run by 2 volunteers, where their real main challenge at the moment is to make sure they have enough money to turn the electricity on a Saturday morning. Tiny museums up and down the country, run really from love more than money. If digital transformation is meaningful, we have a responsibility to bring it to everybody. And it means that all of these types of organisations are going to have to work together to do it. I think we're in a moment now in the UK where that's starting to happen. And I can see signs of it happening in other markets and territories around the world. But it's creating something like this, an action that, like I said, binds lots of different types of organisations, which will mean long-term transformation is possible. Thank you very much.